I'll be your host today. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Suffolk University's Sawyer Business School for hosting this conference. They host a lot of great opportunities for learning both in and outside those classrooms, and we really appreciate their partnership and help with the entirety of Startup Boston Week this year and last year. Now, the goal behind Startup Boston Week is to connect the entire greater Boston and New England startup community. All industries, all startup departments, all bootstrapped and funding stages for 5 lovely days of learning and connecting with one another. The team that creates Startup Boston Week is primarily volunteer, and folks working the conference today are volunteering their time as well. So thank you for attending the conference. It is a labor of love, and we appreciate you playing a role in shaping our startup community. Thank you so much for attending Startup Boston Week. Now onto the session.
Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about engineering for scale. Just so I can get a sense of how much time we want to know we're saving for questions, does anyone walk in with a question that they know they want me to save time for? Okay, we'll see how many come up. I know that I'm not going to drastically let anyone down as we let our panelists keep going. So I think to get started, we have 2 excellent panelists here, Peter and Lata, who both have quite different backgrounds and have worked at different stages of companies and bring their own perspectives. So I'm going to let each of them do a quick intro so you'll know where they're coming from as they answer some of these questions.
I'm Lata Ahuja. So I've worked in a lot of mid-sized companies, a couple of startups. Currently, I'm at CarGurus. I lead the engineering team that builds a solution for selling one's car online. So if you go to CarGurus, sell my car, that's the product or products that my team works on. I've been there for 3 years, and I'm glad to be with you guys tonight.
Hello, my name is Peter Kai. My background is mostly in startups, mixture of some consumer, mostly B2B SaaS. I also spent a few years at Microsoft, and I was most recently the VP of Engineering at Privy, an e-commerce marketing startup that was acquired in 2021 by Attentive Mobile. I spent about a year there after the acquisition, helping with some integration work, and since then I've been on sort of a career break, spending a lot of time on beaches and advising friend startups from the beach, that kind of thing.
Sounds like you have a very similar job to me as a venture capitalist. Lots of beach advice. No, just kidding. From my background, before I was a VC investing in early stage software companies, I was a founder myself. And so I'll try to add some of those insights as we go through as well. But Peter, since you mentioned you've spent time both at Microsoft and then more recently at earlier stage startups, what do you really think are the fundamental engineering practices that people should be building in from the get-go? If you're thinking day one, how should you be thinking about that engineering team?
I think there are a lot of ways to answer this question. I think one that I keep coming back to is, today there's no excuse not to focus on getting your sort of core deployment and on-call metrics in place, and keeping an eye on those as you grow. At multiple companies, as we've scaled, I've seen inattention there can lead to things kind of in a slowly boiled frog situation. Things get out of hand. Making sure that you have tasking specific people and teams to it if necessary to make sure that you're on top of those and deployment times are fast and you have a high success rate. Those are really important. And it's easy to lose sight of them because there's always so many things to handle. That's certainly one thing that comes to mind. I don't know if Lata, have you anything to add to that?
Definitely. I think developer experience is a huge part of just retaining, engaging the engineers. It's also important to, as Pete said, to build in the monitoring, because so much is on the cloud right now, and you need a good feedback loop, because that enables one to know what your end customer wants, because it's at the end of the day, you're building it for the customer, and having good customer metrics and knowing what you're building for, and being able to monitor and being able to respond in a timely manner, it's really, really critical to running a smooth business.
Those are both great insights that people can really think about from the first day. I'd be curious, Lata, since you've been at a large organization like CarGurus recently, what are the types of tools and things you have internally that you think, wow, I wish more early stage teams would do this? What are kind of some of the lessons we can think about from time at scale?
I think the number of tools have grown over time. Like we use Ops Genie, and we use so many tools for alerting and monitoring. But I think what I instill in my engineers is it's not about, there's always going to be bugs. It's not about, having the bugs. Obviously, it's not good. The less the bugs, the better. But it's about how do you respond when there is an issue, right? Because at the end of the day, the goal is for the end consumer not to realize that there is an issue. And so it is about mean time to respond, mean time to repair. And that is what we always focus on, and we call it operational excellence, because nowadays it's just not about being a good engineer. It's also bringing the operational aspects so that when you're in the cloud, which most of us are, the end consumer just doesn't feel the pain of some of the bugs that we as engineers introduce.
And to add to that, one thing that I've found as you scale is necessary is some form or in one way or another, you sort of need feature flagging to sort of decouple your deployments from your launches. That was a thing that I learned very painfully at Privy, because when the work's done, like as an engineer, you want to ship it, you want to get the value out there as soon as you can. But one learning that I learned very painfully that is tangential to this is that you have to kind of see your role kind of expand from just being, oh, my responsibility is to deliver the features as quickly as possible. And as my street cred as an engineer and as an engineering leader, like that hinges a lot on that. But as you grow, you need to kind of step back and make sure that you see your responsibility as also encompassing visibility and legibility into your organization, right? Blindsiding other teams with releases and changes that we're not expecting, which I have done many, many times, is a painful learning experience as you grow, because when you all fit in one room, everyone knows what's happening, right? But you have to be more deliberate about your communication as you scale the organization. And that was a very painful learning experience for me. Hearing from customer support teams that, hey, we had a really bad experience here because the first time we learned about this brand new feature you launched was when some customer asked us how to use it, and so for me, that was like a big learning experience. And so things like feature flagging, that ends up being a much more complicated thing than you think it is. And I learned that the hard way as well. Like people think about different things when they hear feature flagging, right? They're thinking, oh, like, can I use this to A/B test? Like all these Pandora's boxes open. But it ends up being a really, really critical part of all sorts of things, like progressive deployments, right? Like, can you release this to 5% of users and see if there are any big bugs, right? And so that's sort of similar to what Otto was saying. Like, it's not just about, like, are there bugs or not? There will be bugs, but can you limit their impact? Can you limit their blast radius? Can you, get your mean time to resolution down? All these things you have to start paying attention to as you grow, because, the more there is at stake, the more the effects of something can be magnified if you're not paying attention to how do I mitigate the impact of these bugs. And so things like feature flagging and making sure that you have a release process that is separate from your deployment process starts to become really important.
I totally agree. I think the TLDR of that is deploy is not equal to release. But with that said, engineers should be involved in the release process, because you do have an incentive to make sure it's rolled out correctly because you built it. And again, you need to watch out for the gotchas, which some of the business people may not be aware of. So that is, totally agree with that, because we've seen challenges, again, in different ways as to when it's deployed, and everyone's like, what do you mean it's on? What do you mean? It's like, we're not ready for it. And that's why it's good to separate where you say we can take the time for the rollout, but the deploy is done and the engineers are moving on to the next thing.
A thing that came up as both of you were chatting through that was a specific tool came up by name. I think you said Ops Genie. And then whenever feature flagging comes up, I think about how everyone used to roll their own feature flags in-house. And now there's lots of things you can buy. Right. Do either of you have thoughts on when teams should be building versus buying these types of solutions?
I think that's an area that companies do cut back on, but there are tools like LaunchDarkly. There's another tool that I used in a startup that wasn't that expensive. I think it's better to just buy in that case, because it's really when it comes to prioritizing, the feature flag functionality just sits in the backlog. It doesn't get prioritized. And, even though we at CarGurus, we have our homegrown solution, which, as you know, with homegrown solutions, you can have a variety. You can have a file. You can have it in a database setting, which is really not the best way. That's why my 2 cents is, if you can find a solution cheaper than LaunchDarkly, which I did find a slightly inexpensive solution. I forget the name. I would say buy.
I can't disagree with that. And I'll just go back to saying that, like, conceptually, feature flagging seems like it's really simple, but when you get into the nitty-gritty details of how do I get this to work on the mobile app, how do I version our API, how do I work, on the front end and the back end simultaneously, how do I make it robust to when the data store can't be reached? A lot of those complexities rear their ugly head, and then you'll find that you didn't staff, this feature flagging team appropriately. It sounds silly for me to say that, but like that's ultimately what ends up happening. Right? You build it in house and then you realize that it costs more than you thought it would. Although I'll qualify that and say that I think it's sort of domain dependent, since in certain verticals you might care a lot more about progressive rollout or like A/B testing, and these are sort of overlapping but not exactly the same thing concepts. And those tend to sort of, in people's minds, tend to be melded with feature flagging, and they sometimes have overlapping use cases. So again, the point here is that there's a lot of, like, you can pull on a thread and you'll just keep pulling until the cows come home. It's honestly really, really complicated. So honestly, for the most part, you want to buy.
So I think our 2 takeaways so far is that we want to separate our deploy from our release process, and that most of the time when we're thinking about a problem that is going to be more complex than we think, we probably want to buy our solution rather than build it. Those are both a little bit more operationally minded. I'd be curious if we could kind of get into some of the architecture trade-offs that tend to come up. I know one that people talk about all the time is monolith architectures versus microservices. It's a little bit of a rat's nest, but I would be curious to hear both of your opinions there, because I think that's one of the things that comes up right off the bat.
Yeah, so I always believe that you start small. You first find product market fit. So you build an MVP to find product market fit. And then you figure out what you want to do, because the goal of any product, of any business, assuming it's for profit, is obviously to make money. So once you found the product market fit, it really depends on, whether you want to scale and how much you want to scale. And when I say scale, it's about the number of the headcount, whether it's engineering, whether you're QA, all the other folks, and where you think you want to take your business, right? Because there are some business models where the TAM is limited, but some where the TAM is, or the business side wants to invest. So it really depends, because going to microservices sounds easy, and it's a very interesting engineering problem. But it's an investment, and it's a huge investment. And I can tell you from my experience that working at medium-sized companies like Constant Contact, et cetera, I worked at Constant Contact where we had microservices, but I'll tell you, even there, it was like 80 or 90% was services. There's always a monolithic part. And here at CarGurus, again, we are working on separating the services, because every company starts as monolith. And it does take time. It adds to the complexity. It adds to the deploy time. Debugging becomes challenging. So you need to be aware. You have to also measure the SLAs for the APIs, because you have to have good response time, because it impacts all the upstream APIs. So there's a lot to take into consideration when you go to microservices. It sounds simpler. So I would say start with the monolith, and then if you found product market fit, if there is appetite for investment, if there is a need to scale, then, and when I say scale, it's the team, it's the architecture, etc. Then I would say consider microservices, and have a model which takes into consideration, your services, your API. There's so many factors to take into consideration, because you're going to spend not only time building it out, but also time debugging it, and also thinking about tools for it. So it is an endeavor, and it is a journey. I would say we are on this journey in CarGurus, and it's been a few years.
I agree with all that, but I have a different takeaway, which is don't do it. like Shopify is one of the largest like global companies, and they have a gigantic Ruby on Rails monolith. I promise you, your problem can probably be solved without going to microservices. I'm sorry, I beat this drum. This is my drum to beat. Like I hear a lot of conversations with early stage founders who are like, oh yeah, I have a team of 15 engineers and we have 500 microservices, and I'm like, you're doing it wrong. And the big thing I want you to take away from this is that microservices are, for lack of a better analogy, sort of like chemotherapy. They're sort of like the last resort for a problem that you can't really solve any other way. And even in situations where people feel like they have a good like microservices architecture, you can go in there and you'll find that often they did it a little bit too early, right? And they didn't understand how to break down their domains cleanly. So they have like logic that's just copied and pasted everywhere, right? Like they end up rebuilding these similar concepts throughout their microservices because they're not factored correctly, because they've introduced a distributed monolith, right? Where everything's tightly coupled, but they didn't have the time and inclination to figure out where the seams are to create like a well-factored system. And you don't need to introduce a network boundary between your services to make them scalable. I think, again, the example of Shopify is, I think, a really great counterexample to that.
I like the strong opinions. I think we should keep it up. I'm going to throw in one more related strong opinion, which is you should pick a boring programming language that's well suited to the domain that you're building in. With one of my startups, we decided to build in OCaml, which probably no one has heard of, because it's a very niche functional programming language, mostly used by French PhD students and also the hedge fund Jane Street. And trying to hire people who know OCaml is extremely unpleasant. And so if we're going with Rails monoliths are great. JavaScript, a great choice, despite its many problems. But I would say overall, a lot of the time from the get-go, you want to be thinking about what are kind of the boring choices I can make, and only picking unusual things when it really overlaps with your domain. Anything else? Any more controversial opinions to throw in? Okay, cool. So then maybe we can talk a little bit. I think that's a lot of the choices people are going to be making from the get-go. How should people be thinking about things as their startup starts growing? Maybe they get to that product market fit, traffic starting to grow. What's gonna break first for most people, and how should we start thinking about those problems?
Seams will develop between teams that will lead to dropped balls, right? Where people are like, well, no one has that responsibility explicitly. And then you'll have the opposite problem where, two different teams think they own something. So some of this is personality driven, and sometimes it's just, how did you organize your teams? And taking down a note to say, I'm gonna look at this quarterly or annually or whatever cadence makes sense for you, depending on how quickly you're growing, is, I think, a learning that I made early on as we continue to kind of double and triple our company, because new things come up that it's not in the wiki, it's not in any of your playbooks, and I think that's par for the course. And again, like, there will be some people who care really strongly about owning something or not, and sometimes that'll influence whether you end up giving that responsibility to that team. And at small scale, like, some of that works because it's a personality driven, like I said, but you kind of need a larger like team charter, right? Like, what are your areas of responsibility, and coming up with those and making sure that they very neatly encapsulate areas of responsibility without overlap, or at least minimizing that as much as possible. I found to be a continuous challenge. As we expand into new markets, as we added new product lines, these things are constantly in shift, right? As you grow. So that was one challenge that I definitely found.
Well, there's definitely that challenge because, again, products grow and then you have to figure out what to do with the team. So the way I like to think of it is that each team, the teams need to know what their North Star is. They need to know what their metrics are, what they're solving for. And even if it's for a quarter, that's fine. And it changes the next quarter, that's okay. But they need to be aware, and that's what they need to work towards. And the way we do it at CarGurus. So CarGurus is a very, very data-driven company. So if you go to the site, we'll give you a lot of data, and that's how we build trust. And the reason being, our founder is also the founder of TripAdvisor, so it's like the same theme carries on. But that's one thing that we do. We set goals, or we have OKRs. I mean, you can use OKRs or MBOs or whatever you want to use, and then we measure. It's like we have customer metrics. For us, it could be the leads. That is how many leads come into our sites. That's one metric, and then we do A/B testing along the way. So we have in every team of ours. What makes us slightly different from most companies, I should say, I haven't seen it in other companies. We have the engineers, we don't have QA, but we do have a data analyst on the team. And they keep us very honest. So before we do A/B tests, and honestly, depending on the data, sometimes we don't roll out functionality. So I think I find that method to be really helpful in measuring the impact of the customer even before it's fully rolled out. We roll back and we throw away the work sometimes. So that's something that I really enjoy. And everything that we sort of deliver, we already have metrics, and we can predict what the impact will be. And we actually go back and sometimes check. So that's something that I find very helpful in my current role, which I thought I would share.
Those are both super interesting answers and got us kind of more into the organizational side of things, which I do want to spend more time on. I was curious if you have any kind of specific opinions about how people should think about increasing amount of traffic to a website or increasing number of users, or kind of any rule of thumb thresholds around those, or even heuristics, since I know every company kind of has a different set of metrics.
So we are always looking to increase traffic. So if you look at our site, cargurus.com, anything that has consumer facing, of course, so for those of you who may not know, it's a marketplace, right? It's two-sided because there's consumers and there's dealers. We really don't hold any inventory, so that's the beauty for most of our products. I can get the new product lines, but they're traditional. But for us, it's always about driving traffic to our website. And it could be through SEO. It could be through the search engine optimization. And that means you have to really work with Google, and that is really tough. It could be through paid marketing. Of course, it could be, when we say paid, it's also, we do a lot of brand marketing. And of course, it's also building great products, right? Like there are times when I just walk into Costco and I wear my CarGurus shirt and somebody's like, "Oh, I love CarGurus." And I'm like, "That's great. That's that's what you want to hear." And it's because we build trust. I think that's why, but it's also just building great products where people want to come back. So I think those are some of the ways to sort of drive the traffic and grow the number of users. We also do a lot in terms of, honestly, via the products, we do a lot of retention, which could be very noisy. So for example, if you were to visit our website and say you were to go into one of my products, which my T-bills, which is Sell My Car, because you landed there, we have some of the information and we send the email to you, which can be annoying, but everybody does that. That is called retention. So we have means of retention to get more users back. But I think the fundamental thing is to build great products where people want to come back and actually use your product or your service.
I just want to clarify, is that like the type of answer you're looking for? Because I can give you 30 seconds on that, but I just wanted to clarify, make sure that was what you wanted.
That was super interesting. That was great. The other option would also be if we wanted to talk about what happens, like if load spikes suddenly, and how we want to think about architecting our systems to handle that sort of challenge.
Scalability.
Yeah.
Okay, I can answer both of those. So at Privy, we're an e-commerce marketing platform, so we help mostly small merchants sell online and be successful doing that. And one thing that my CEO Ben and I found was that like the best way to reach these folks was to essentially become one of them and find where the underground hangouts are essentially, and go blend in with them and be like, hey, you should use Privy, but like basically like reaching them, like do things that don't scale, right? Reaching them where they are rather than like spending a lot of money up front on what may end up being ineffective like brand marketing or paid marketing is one way to do things that don't scale, right? And like, so we previously ran our own e-commerce store for many years. Like we would open up a Shopify store and we would just sell our own merchandise. And people love our logo for some reason. So people didn't know what Privy was, and they were like, yeah, I want a mug with Privy on it. And we're like, okay, cool. It's $25. And so like we got really good at like being in the mindset of our core customer, right? And that helped us know where to go next and who to talk to next and what conferences do they hang out at. And that drove traffic to our site. But as far as, how do you actually handle that load once you've done a good job at that? I think, the traditional answer is it kind of comes down to making sure you have a good handle on your data stores, right? Usually that's the kind of thing that is difficult to scale. Hopefully everything else you've architected to kind of be shared nothing, so you can just kind of scale that out horizontally. But yeah, make sure you pay attention to your databases. Most of the time you can probably come up with a good solution that involves sharding, which is basically partitioning your groups into basically smaller virtual slices of a database that you can handle, and that works well if you have like a really natural partition key. So like if you sell to businesses, you can partition by like your company or your business, since if you're building a CRM, for example, then company A doesn't need to necessarily access company B's contacts or whatever, so you can store them in a physically distinct shard, and that's one way you can scale out. And that's sort of the approach that we've been taking, and I recommend that as a first step.
Don't shard before you reach product market fit. I was once at a company where we sharded on the individual user and then pivoted to being B2B, and it was like the bane of everyone on the engineering
Can I change my
team's
answer?
existence. Yeah.
Don't shard, but if you do it well.
Well, so definitely consider the database, but there are other factors too, such as the architecture, which we can, but that is something I would say you start small, but always think about making it extensible. And so some of the factors are the architecture, the tools, technology, frameworks that you use, very important. Like in one company, we used Rails, and I'm telling you, and part of the company used Rails, large part used Java. So easy to scale with Java. Rails, we were always challenged. And it's like the engineering teams would look at each other because the Rails engineers would bang their heads against the wall and they would always be challenged. So database, of course, but there are other factors such as your caching, which you have to consider, and even your code. It's like you have to constantly optimize your code. And the thing that also gets overlooked sometimes is your dependencies or your third-party dependencies. So for example, CarGurus, we partner with a company called CarOffer, and we're constantly sending data back and forth, and that sometimes becomes our limitation. I mean, we don't think of it, but it is a limiting factor. So thinking about what the limitations, what you work through it. So I think from the get-go, it's like you need to consider these factors, and you need to consider them so that you're not doing anything to limit your ability to scale in the future. You don't have to do anything about them right from the get-go, but definitely it's like if you want to scale, these are all considerations one needs to factor in, so that it's like when it's time to scale, you have to work through each of these layers so that one can scale successfully. And there's no limitation for the business, because the last thing the business wants to hear is we have a bottleneck. They really don't care about all the technical mumbo jumbo. They're like, just tell me, I want to go from 100 to 1 million users. How long will it take? Right?
Next, we'll be getting into the next topic. Dimitri, sorry for. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. All right. So the next topic will be cost implications of scalability. What are the cost implications of building scalable solutions, both in terms of initial investment and ongoing expenses? How can organizations balance the need for scalability with the budget constraints?
I think this hits on some of the themes we've been talking about already, with not making things too complicated before you have to. We haven't had a great Kubernetes debate yet, but perhaps your day one company doesn't need Kubernetes. It can get really expensive. You can suddenly have a ton of pods spun up. You can have a lot of instances for relatively low traffic. I think there have been a lot of really interesting things with patterns people have done recently. I know DHH at Basecamp has talked a lot about like, oh, we just run our own servers now. Or there's a project management company called Linear, and it only costs them $160 a month to run their entire European user base. And part of that is like an interesting sync architecture they have, but part of that is just like, yeah, we're running it on 2 CPUs instead of having this like massively scalable thing. And their company is probably much larger than many of the companies you're building right now. And it would be great to get there and it'd be great to get beyond that. But I think simpler infrastructure works better than people think it does.
I wish I gave that answer.
In terms of cost, I do agree with that. But I think it's like I said, it's like you have to think about, it's like, I think building the financial responsibility of the team, especially when one goes to cloud, it's really important because it's really easy to blow away the budget because it's like, and I think now with being in the cloud, one can think of different technologies where it's like it's only on demand. I think that elasticity really helps. So I think what the term I use with my teams is fiscally responsible, that is being aware of not just the architecture and your code, but also it's like, what is the cost? What is the total cost of ownership? And that's how, I look at it.
And candidly, that's one of the questions that comes up the most in board meetings now. One of the things CTOs are being asked to talk about is still their future-looking roadmap, but another big piece of it is cloud cost, specifically with a lot of tools people adopted and used a ton, and then the bills start spiraling larger and larger over time. I spend a lot of time talking to people about their Datadog bills, for instance, because it's great to have every log of everything that's ever happened. But then there's the real question of it's expensive and like, what are you really getting out of that? And how are you making a better end user experience?
That ends up being a repeat thing that I also see as well. And I think there's a dichotomy between like, can we use virtualization and Docker and all these latest technologies to like be less platform dependent on compute? And that gets you to a commoditization layer that's very competitive and that you can usually find a really, great vendor for. But if you're, on a proprietary platform like Datadog or, in our case, like we have some data stores that were in Amazon, for example, or some proprietary cloud, those have a gravity, right, that makes it hard to migrate off of. And they're, intentionally designed to be really easy to start on, but hard to migrate off of. And the incremental cost becomes, there's a tipping point, right, where it ends up being really, really burdensome, even though it was like, it was $5 a month to start. And so things like, oh, I should get reservations for my EC2 instances. Like that's very standard stuff and that's easy for compute. But for, again, data stores, you want to pay really, really special attention to like, do I have a dependency on this vendor that is specific to my product that I have no other alternative for? And those end up being, again, like we had conversations about this when I was at Privy. And some of our largest spend was like, well, we picked this data vendor 7 years ago and we're just with them and we've been scaling with them. And that's really great because we don't have to think about it so much. But there is a point where that cost benefit analysis tips. And we're like, oh, we're big enough now that we could potentially hire someone to take care of this. And that math might actually work out. But unfortunately, there's like a migration path. So again, like not only is like the technology that you depend on in terms of data store is really important because it's hard to move later and hard to change or answer later. Your actual vendor for that product also matters a lot because someday you may not want to move, but you may want to have the option to move for the leverage. And that will matter a lot.
In any of the organizations that you guys worked in, what has been like the worst around like costs with infrastructure or scalability and things like that?
I think Ellen already said it's about not being aware and blowing the budget and literally the finance team walking up to you and saying, hey, have you seen your spend? It's like, can we turn off instances? Can we migrate to an architecture that is more on demand? I think the awareness is a huge part of it.
Okay.
I think at the end of the day, no business is going to say we can't scale because we can't pay for the servers. Like if you've built a business that has correct margins, which most software businesses do, it's going to be substantial. But it's going to work for you. And so if people are starting to have those conversations around cost, it's usually something that's an outlier or something that is maybe technically interesting, but isn't serving like a clear business or end user need.
All right. Well, thank you. So the next topic will be organizational culture and scalability. How does organizational culture influence the ability to build and maintain scalable systems? What cultural factors contribute to successful scaling efforts?
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah. Anybody can jump in and go first. Yeah.
I think with the benefit of hindsight, I think one thing that I thought I was spending enough time on, but I think now maybe I wasn't, was hiring. And the reason I say that is that when I got to Attentive, which was a larger company and in many respects growing faster when we joined them, and I got a chance to look at their hiring docs, it really distilled for me some core concepts that I thought I was doing really well, but I thought, wow, like I can be doing this way better. And like the way you think about hiring is maybe the most important thing. It's actually more important, I think, than actually who you hire, because the process that you go through to hire people is upstream of that, right? So like a lot of people I talk to, like they're like, oh yeah, what kinds of questions are you going to ask during the interview? But why those questions, and how do they tie back to the things you're looking for? And what kinds of answers are you looking for, and why is that a good answer, and what is a bad answer, and why? And so you tug on this thread and you want to like get really, really like technical about this. And the most important thing that I've learned is that you want to write this down, because that forces you to clarify your thinking about this in a way that you can't otherwise, right? If you're just verbally kind of bullying your way through it. And I think the hiring aspect, like the longest that I've developed someone before I hired them was 5 years, and they were absolutely worth the time. And it's just really, really difficult to do a good job at this if you haven't thought about really, really hard, what are the attributes I'm looking for? How do I test for them? What kinds of answers am I looking for? And just being honest with yourself about like, what kinds of answers do I expect? And not post facto, but ahead of time, thinking about like, if I got that kind of answer, how would I rate that person, right? And I think for me, especially when I did that exercise, I was like, oh, I think half the time I'm just winging it, and then and then in the future, I'm not going to wing it. I'm going to write down what I expect. And now I have a framework that I can use to train people on this, right? And so for managers, you have to uphold the high standards for that, right? You have to go and be like, here's what I've written up. I want you to review this. I want your comments. And you have to have a whole system for training people up for hiring, because who you hire turns around and hires other people, and that's the kind of company you end up building. So it's in a very indirect way, it's the most important thing you do. And I think that's like a platitude, but it's also something that I learned really, really reinforced for me when I went to a larger company that I thought did it really, really well. And they had extensive documentation, and they had tables and tables of their questions and what kinds of answers to expect and how good they were according to their rubric. And that for me was the level of detail that I realized that most organizations need to get to, but they often don't, because they just don't spend enough time on it. They think they do, but they don't.
So I'll answer the question slightly differently, not to be controversial, but the scalability I think are from the systems, etc. And I feel like if the company really cares about the end customer experience, then scalability is important, because you're going to hit scalability issues even if you become slightly bigger, right? And the way I think about it is, it's very hard to honestly explain to the board. I've been at the table, or people, the non-technical people, I would say, about why some engineering work is needed, and scalability is part of it, right? And I'm looking at you because I'm sure you go through this, but and I struggled a lot of times at companies trying to explain it to the execs as to why we have to work. And at CarGurus, we had a CTO, and he came up with this really nice model. It's like, you have the product work, which I've always had product backlog and then a tech backlog, and you sort of combine it together because the whole needs to be 100%. But he has a framework where it's like in the tech bucket, there is compliance, security, tech debt, replatforming. And in the replatforming, you can do it. And sometimes the way we do scalability work is we either shift it to the feature work, that is the product work. We say, you want it? Well, it's coming out of your budget, because we try and as engineers, try to save our engineering buckets for ourselves. And so I think that's the way we've gone around it. And actually that framework helps us explain to the execs or the business people as to why we are working on something. And some of our work is identified as non-discretionary. That is, it just has to be done, right? Like for us, security and compliance is non-discretionary. If it comes up, has to be done. Any security vulnerability, there's no question, there's no if buts. But the scalability, we sort of, if it's too big, we definitely put it in the product bucket. And especially if the product people have asked for it. Like for example, in the solution that we are building for selling one's car online, what we do is generate offers. Essentially, if you go, you put in all the details of your car, you get an offer, and you as a consumer say, hey, I like it or don't like it. And in our current version of the product, we give you choices, and you can sell it 100% online, or you can take it to a dealer and sell it. But we have to generate offers. And that offer service we knew needed to be scaled at some point. But we waited for the business to ask for it because we knew it was going to be big. And that's how we worked through it. I think even if the company supports it, because everybody wants the end consumer experience to be great, I think it's always a negotiation with their product person.
I definitely agree with that. I think a lot of the times being able to do this organizationally means giving people a shared set of language to be able to use. Like you mentioned before, MTTR, or mean time to response. I think that's one of the DORA metrics for engineering experience, but it's gotten to the point where people in the C-suite or at the board level generally understand what that means. And that means, hey, if we have a problem and our largest enterprise customer notices it, it's going to take us how long to fix it? And if you're CrowdStrike and you've caused a giant outage that's taken down every company for 3 days, like that's a big problem when you can't fix it right away. And so from that standpoint, like having that shared vocabulary around why this really matters to the business so we can invest in the work is important. And then on the more micro level, I think to what Lotto was saying earlier, it's really about engineers being able to have ownership over what they do and kind of know, hey, I'm going to ship this to prod, users are going to have it. When I see an error coming in, I'm going to be holding that pager and I'm going to be responsible for it. And I'm going to be directly working on how to fix it. And maybe it's not you're only responsible for your own features, but it can also just be having that sense of, if I'm paged and something's wrong, I know what steps I can take to try to resolve it, and making sure that ownership and understanding is shared throughout the team. So you're not constantly putting every incident on like a small team of talented people, which can really cause burnout and organizational instability.
Okay. So one interesting question I have to you three in the position that you're in is, how much does engineering documenting the work that they're doing contribute to this?
Well, I think documentation gets stale. We write wikis and it gets stale. So we try, but I wouldn't say the documentation is the sure bet. Like for us, and I think products are living, what we do is on a monthly basis, we have an all hands, we have the business context, and then we have the context of what we built. And I think that is a recent snapshot. And we try to keep our wikis updated, but I'm telling you, it's always a challenge.
I also have like a variation of this problem where there are certain types of wikis that I describe as write only. Mm-hmm. And there are things you can try to do to mitigate that, right? When someone asks you a question, you be that annoying person that's like, instead of giving you the answer, like you give them the URL to the wiki, right? And then like you just keep doing that until people learn that like this is the place I go to understand, which teams, areas of responsibility are, right, for this quarter, and things like that. And again, like some of this ends up just being unavoidable because it's just much easier and faster to like develop tribal knowledge verbally than it is to write everything down. And then like, most people are not like, they don't have a degree in library science or whatever. So like the organization of the wiki itself becomes a problem, right? Because the more you use it, the more it gets filled up with duplicate data, stale data. So then it becomes untrustworthy and you find something there and it's like, but is this still true? Like, and you're like doing like archaeology to be like, oh, Mark is still here. Maybe we can ask him, So you end up kind of having to talk to people anyway in a lot of cases. The two things that I found work really well for writing are, one, like when you have like a big change or a new thing you're doing, like that initiative, writing down the why I think is really important, because that almost never changes. Like, why are we doing this, right? And if you try to like repeat it verbally, it kind of gets mutated as sort of in a game of telephone. But writing it down forces you again to like think clearly about what it is that you're doing and why. And that tends to stand the test of time much more than specific architecture decisions or engineering designs and that kind of thing. So I definitely recommend you do that and refer to that often. And often, our leadership team had a really great like quarterly thing where we'd actually go back and review initiatives in the past, because that breaks the cycle of having write-only documents, right? We're gonna go back and review this and be like, which of these predictions ended up being true? Like, which assumptions did we rely on that ended up being true or false? And did we do a good job with what we knew at the time? I think that ends up being a really useful exercise and a good way to like encourage a writing culture, since that is one thing that as you begin to scale becomes more and more important, since again, as you start a company, like if everyone fits in the same room, then it's very hard to get out of sync, right? Almost anything works organizationally. But encouraging a writing culture ends up being a thing that becomes necessary as you get beyond the 2-pizza team kind of thing. But then you have to have that kind of culture shift where instead of ephemeral Slack chats or verbal conversations, you have to have a shared repository of knowledge that you can respond to and evolve and people actually use. Like, again, like there are tricks to make sure that actually does get used, and it's not only a write-only kind of documentation system.
Cool. Thank you for the answer. So we have about 9 minutes left, so I'm gonna open up to the floor for anyone to ask the panelists questions. We can go right here in the front.
Yeah. So when it comes to tech debt, let's say you, yeah. So when it comes to tech debt, let's say you've started building something and then you've scaled, 1, 2, 3 or more orders of magnitude in users, operations, what have you. Do y'all have any sort of philosophy when it comes to handling tech debt, or methodologies, et cetera, anything of the like? I'm just curious.
I think the first step for tech debt is just dealing with it, honestly. Because what do we do as engineers? We build the coolest thing and say, we do that later. So I think we have a rule about, not, I forget what the thing is, not creating, I know. It's like if you create tech debt, you have to open a ticket to deal with it and bring it into your backlog. Now, when we address it is still TBD. Or you could do it with production issues too, because there is a need. It's like sometimes it's like you have to address something right away. It's like you do a shortcut, but it's like, you have to come back to the longer term solution. And that I feel we used to handle at one of our companies, because we had a team who would oversee all production issues, and they would come back and they would follow up and say, did you actually address this issue? So not that you need, but I feel like, so we have the method that we have where we have a certain percentage of our budget to deal with tech debt, compliance, and security. It gives us the freedom, or the engineers sometimes, to just pick up tickets to the backlog that are tech debt. And they don't have to feel obliged to let product know. I mean, of course they let them know, but it's part of the fact that it's just our culture. It's just the way we work. You have to address tech debt in every sprint.
Lada, to your point earlier, I think you were saying that there are some times when it just makes sense to essentially bury tech debt in the budget for a feature. Like if there's a feature that's going to touch that thing next,
Right.
You can just count that as, oh yeah, this is just necessary pay down that we do as a part of working in this area. And we like to, use the scout rule, right? Like we leave everything nicer, right, than we found it. And that tends to go over much better at a high level when you're talking to C-level than, oh yeah, we have like 50% of our capacity reserved for all these things that, are meaningless to you, right? When you use terms like, oh yeah, we're gonna migrate off jQuery, and they're like, what's that? I'm like, let me tell you, right? They don't want that, right? They don't want that conversation. So as much as that is possible, and I think the other thing that often comes up is you just have to really, really triage it with maybe stepping out of the engineer's mindset for a little bit, because some things seem like they're emergencies because your sense of engineering self-worth is like making something as pristine and amazing as possible. And there are other times when like, no, this is an emergency. Our database is running out of integers and we're going to need to fix this or we will be hard down, right? Like we've had those like true emergencies where like, we're going to dedicate this quarter to making sure that doesn't happen. And there are others where it's like, actually, now that we think about it in an impartial way, this is not as big of an emergency as we actually think it is. Like the actual business impact when we write it down is like not that bad. So we can punt for a little bit, or we can just scale up and take the hit to the budget because we're on a larger instance that's less optimized, or whatever the case may be, is often the right answer, right? Like the best way to deal with debt is to ignore it. Like also true for technical debt, but the point is like, if you don't have to pay it back, that's the best kind of debt, so ignore it, cross that bridge when you get to it. And sometimes it's actually further in the distance than it seems like it is, because your sense as an engineer that like, oh, I got to fix this because it bothers me aesthetically is like actually what's happening, right? And not because, oh, there's a real business problem that's around the corner. My 2 cents.
Hi, I'm curious, when you start thinking about addressing single points of failure or building resiliency or redundancy, is that sort of a continuous evaluation, or is there sort of a break point where you say like, okay, we're going to get serious about distributing?
Yeah. So I think addressing that is really expensive, single points of failure or redundancy, and I don't think I've seen a lot of companies doing that. I've seen that at one company where we did constant contact, but it was like we looked at critical user paths or user journeys. So for example, they logged in, saved their account. It's like it had to be really critical where we would not annoy the users. But for the rest, if you can sort of fail gracefully and let the user try in a few minutes. So that was the only place where I've really seen like redundancy, but it comes at so much of an overhead. I think I've seen banks do it. They actually have a framework. I forget what it's called. They have an acronym for it, and they go all out and they do all this testing, but I really haven't seen that in most software companies.
Yeah, at the lowest infrastructural levels, that's gotten a lot easier with the cloud services, for example, like your data storage. You can usually click a button to pay double what you normally pay, and then now you have 2 instances with one running in a backup, region somewhere else. But I think at a higher like service level, that ends up being really, really expensive, and that ends up being a question that's domain dependent. Like, how big a deal is it if your system goes offline? Does an airline rely on your services? Right, like, so in other cases, like, you do like you run the service for Fortnite. It's not a big deal, right? Like, but if you have paying customers and there are planes in the air, then maybe think about it.
And I think you want to like take that into account when you're writing your customer contracts and you're looking at the SLAs that you're signing and what you're agreeing to. And if you have customers who are in those high value businesses and you're going to be paying them a huge amount of money if something goes wrong, it's perhaps worth it to invest more there. Whereas in the early days, probably not.
So we have 2 minutes left. We have time for one more question.
I'll talk really quickly. I think it was touched on a little bit in the previous question, but I'm curious about times in your careers where you've been able to partner with product as you scale to realize that certain things weren't important. Hey, this data isn't important to be immediately available. We can do a materialized view. Hey, the customer doesn't at all give a shit about this. We can just drop this table, and how that's enabled you to scale.
So at the end of it, the product or the business really don't care about the how. I shouldn't put it that way, but they really just want you to sort of make it seamless to the user. So whether you create a materialized view or whether you drop it, I think they're going to be like, is it going to work for me? Is it going to work for the end consumer? I think the best thing I would recommend is that for the engineers or the engineering team to really understand the context and as to what the product is asking for and why. Because then you can, do what is needed from an engineering perspective. I don't think most product folks really want to get into the nitty-gritty. unless they're very technical, of course.
As a product person masquerading as an engineer / VC, I think product people think very much in trade-offs. And so anytime you have like an engineering option, you're like, oh, I could do this or I could do this. Most good product counterparts want to hear that. And if you can say, oh, I could do the thing I think you're asking me for, and it's going to take us 6 months, or I can do this other thing that I think is pretty close, and maybe you do or maybe you don't, but it's only going to take 2 weeks. Every product person wants to at least hear what that trade-off is.
Thank you so much for all of your time. We are going to have to cut it here because it is 6 o'clock. We have a lot more in store for all of you today. We have a keynote happening downstairs right now with Yvonne Howe, Secretary of Economic Development, and Boston Globe's Scott Krisner. Highly recommend attending that. And that wraps it up for today. Thank you all very much.